At the heart of this tension lies the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, a colossal hydroelectric project built on the Blue Nile, which Ethiopia sees as a beacon of hope and development. In recent weeks, the conflict has escalated dramatically. Heated exchanges between officials, public protests, and growing fears of regional instability have dominated headlines, raising concerns far beyond the two countries' borders. Meanwhile, devastating floods in Sudan have added fuel to the fire. Egypt has pointed fingers at Ethiopia's dam management, blaming it for the disaster, while Ethiopia firmly denies any responsibility, deepening mistrust. Years of failed negotiations and diplomatic stalemates have left both sides entrenched. For Ethiopia, the dam is a symbol of national pride and a promise of electricity for millions who still live without reliable power. For Egypt, however, the Nile is a lifeblood, its only major source of fresh water. Any threat to its flow is seen as a direct threat to the nation's survival, especially for farmers and communities who depend on it daily. The dam's final filling, completed without a binding agreement, has pushed relations to a new low, leaving both sides anxious and uncertain about the future. The international community watches anxiously, urging restraint and dialogue as the rhetoric between Egypt and Ethiopia grows ever more intense. At the core, the most critical issue remains unresolved: how the dam will be operated, especially during times of drought, and how water will be shared fairly without a clear, enforceable legal framework. Every move by either side is closely watched, with each action scrutinized for signs of escalation or compromise. The Nile, once a symbol of life and unity, now stands as a potential flashpoint for conflict, casting a shadow over the region's future. The stakes have never been higher, not just for Egypt and Ethiopia, but for the entire Horn of Africa, as the world waits to see what happens next. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has issued his strongest warning yet over the GERD dispute. He declared Egypt will defend its historical rights to the Nile, signaling a shift from diplomacy to a more confrontational stance. "We do not interfere in others' affairs, but when it comes to Egypt's water, we will never compromise," he stated. This red line frames the issue as one of national security, raising the stakes for both countries. The warning aims to rally domestic support and urge international intervention, especially after the dam's fourth filling and Sudan's floods. Egypt's patience with negotiations is wearing thin, and the world is left to wonder what all necessary measures might mean. The message is clear. Egypt's commitment to diplomacy is not unlimited. Water security is now explicitly tied to national survival. The region holds its breath as the possibility of escalation grows. Egypt's stance on the GERD is rooted in its absolute dependence on the Nile, a river that has shaped the nation's destiny for millennia. The Nile is not just a waterway, it is the very lifeblood of Egypt, sustaining its people, culture, and economy through the ages. The river provides over 90% of Egypt's fresh water for more than 100 million people, quenching the thirst of sprawling cities and remote villages alike. Every drop is precious, supporting daily life and the country's growing population. Egypt's annual water needs far exceed its available resources, making any reduction in Nile flow a dire threat. Water scarcity is already a harsh reality, and even a small decrease could have devastating consequences for food security and livelihoods. The 1959 agreement, unrecognized by Ethiopia, allocates most of the river's water to Egypt, but even this leaves the country in deficit. Egypt has long relied on these historic treaties to safeguard its share, yet the future remains uncertain. Agriculture, the backbone of Egypt's economy, relies entirely on the Nile. Millions of farmers depend on its waters to grow wheat, rice, and other essential crops that feed the nation. Any upstream project that alters the river's flow is seen as an existential risk. The construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has heightened these fears, raising questions about future water availability. Egypt demands a binding agreement on the dam's operation, especially during droughts, to protect its fragile water balance. Without such assurances, the country feels exposed to unpredictable changes beyond its control. Without guarantees, Egypt fears being at the mercy of Ethiopia's decisions. The uncertainty fuels anxiety among ordinary Egyptians who depend on the river for their very survival. The Nile is not just a resource. It's Egypt's identity and survival. Generations have lived and thrived along its banks, and its waters are woven into the fabric of daily life and national pride. This deep dependency drives Cairo's uncompromising position. For Egypt, negotiating over the Nile is not just about policy, it is about protecting the future of an entire nation. For Egypt, the stakes are nothing less than national existence. The Nile's fate is inseparable from the fate of Egypt itself. For Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known as the GERD, is far more than just a massive infrastructure project. It stands as a powerful symbol of national sovereignty, unity, and hope for a brighter future. The dam has become a rallying point for Ethiopians everywhere, inspiring pride and a renewed sense of purpose. The Blue Nile, which begins its journey in the lush Ethiopian highlands, provides the majority of the Nile's water. Yet, for generations, Ethiopia has watched this vital resource flow beyond its borders, unable to fully benefit from its own river. The GERD represents a turning point, a chance to finally harness the river's immense potential for the nation's development. Built with the determination and financial contributions of ordinary Ethiopians, the dam is set to become Africa's largest hydroelectric power plant. Once fully operational, it will more than double Ethiopia's current power output, providing a reliable source of energy for millions. Access to reliable electricity will transform daily life, lighting up rural homes, powering new industries, and giving children the chance to study after dark. For many, it means the promise of jobs, better health care, and a path out of poverty. Ethiopia also plans to export surplus electricity to neighboring countries, strengthening its economy and increasing its influence across East Africa. The GERD could become a cornerstone of regional integration and shared prosperity. Government officials emphasize that the dam is designed for power generation, not for consuming or diverting water. They assure that the river's flow will continue downstream, addressing concerns of neighboring countries. Supporters argue that the GERD will help regulate the river's flow, reduce the risk of devastating floods, and ensure a more stable water supply for everyone who depends on the Nile. For Ethiopia, the dam is also about justice, correcting the legacy of colonial-era treaties that denied the country a fair share of its own water. It's a statement of self-determination and national dignity. For millions of Ethiopians, the GERD is a dream realized, a bold step toward prosperity, self-reliance, and a future shaped by their own hands. The government presents the dam as a tool for regional cooperation, not a source of conflict, inviting dialogue and partnership with its neighbors. The promise of the Renaissance Dam is one of progress and shared opportunity, but its reality remains deeply contested, both within Ethiopia and across the region. Negotiations over the GERD have dragged on for more than a decade, with little progress. Egypt and Sudan demand a binding treaty on dam operations, especially during droughts, while Ethiopia resists any agreement that limits its development. Dispute resolution remains a sticking point. Egypt wants international arbitration. Ethiopia insists on regional control. Ethiopia offers data sharing and flexible guidelines, but Egypt sees this as insufficient. Talks broke down in 2023, deepening mistrust on all sides. Egypt accuses Ethiopia of stalling and acting unilaterally. Ethiopia accuses Egypt of clinging to outdated treaties. Sudan is caught in the middle, sometimes siding with Egypt, sometimes seeing benefits from the dam. Years of failed diplomacy have hardened positions and made compromise elusive. In September 2025, Ethiopia completed the final filling of the GERD and celebrated its inauguration. Egypt and Sudan immediately condemned the move as a violation of international norms and a threat to their water security. Egypt accused Ethiopia of disregarding downstream interests and acting without a binding agreement. Severe floods in Sudan soon followed, with Egypt blaming Ethiopia's dam management and Ethiopia denying responsibility. The blame game has intensified hostility, closing the door on further negotiations. For Egypt, the event confirmed fears of unchecked Ethiopian control. For Ethiopia, it was a national triumph. The region now faces a new phase of confrontation, with trust at an all-time low. The world is watching the Nile dispute with growing alarm. The UN, EU, and US have all urged restraint and a return to negotiations, insisting there is no military solution. Mediation efforts have faltered, with the US losing credibility and the African Union unable to bridge the divide. Some analysts suggest Gulf states or Turkey could play a new mediating role. Despite calls for dialogue, the international response has been cautious and largely ineffective. The UN Security Council has deferred to regional bodies, leaving the parties to resolve the crisis themselves. The risk of wider instability looms as the dispute drags on. The roots of the GERD conflict stretch back to colonial-era treaties. The 1929 and 1959 agreements, brokered by Britain, gave Egypt and Sudan control over the Nile, excluding Ethiopia and other upstream nations. Ethiopia rejects these treaties as relics of colonialism, arguing they are unjust and outdated. For Ethiopia, the GERD is a rejection of historical injustice and a claim to its rightful share of the river. Egypt, however, sees these agreements as the foundation of its water rights and national survival. This legal and historical divide makes compromise difficult. Both sides operate from fundamentally different starting points. The past continues to fuel present-day animosity and mistrust.